I'm really honoured to be here today. So thank you to everyone for turning up to listen and for inviting me to be the keynote. So I'd really like to also acknowledge the Indigenous people across Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, on whose traditional lands and waters we live, work and gather. And in particular, I would like to acknowledge Mana Whenua, where I'm currently speaking from at the University of Auckland, Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, and where I work at Te Papa Te Aotearoa. So when I was first asked to give this keynote, I have to admit to feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome, purely out of great respect for my colleagues in the art curatorial team at Te Papa and the art researchers that are in this room and that I've encountered over the years. Because, of course, this is a symposium about Asian art. And my first thought was, well, I don't have a PhD in art history. I'm an amateur artist, passionate one, but an amateur artist at best. And I'm not even technically an art curator. I'm a curator at Te Papa in the history team, and we also have an art team as well. So I had to think about this a little bit more and think about the themes of the conference. And, after a bit of back and forth and some discussion with Olivier, I did come to think, well, I might have something to offer, in the crossover of the themes that we've got here today, because of course I do deal with art in my role as curator Asian New Zealand histories all the time. That might be sometimes as the go-to curator for many in the Asian Aotearoa arts community. It's dealing with the many textiles and cultural objects that are in our legacy ethnological collections at the museum, which fall under history. And it can also be in terms of acquiring art, which the history team also does a lot of. It's just that the ways in which we assign significance to creative work differ from our art colleagues. Because, of course, art is an extremely important medium through which the public accesses our histories, our society's myriad interpretations of past events and developments. So in this presentation, I have chosen to focus on the threads that connect history, art and creative work that engages with the past, including the recent past, and I want to do that through the mode of activism. So why activism? Because protests and social activist work are sites where history and artistic creativity frequently collide, and where what can be remembered of past protests, promises, earlier periods of history are re-envisioned and imagined for the future, often to cultivate hope for change in some sense of that word. And so today, I'm hoping I can peel back the curtain at Te Papa a little bit to offer some insight into how Asian activists and artists who utilise tools of memory and engage with memory institutions like museums have done so at Te Papa in the years that I've been there. So I hope my screen isn't blocking this too much, but a little bit about me, just to kind of orientate ourselves. So I am really pleased to be back in my home city today to give this keynote. I was born in Tamaki Makaurau, born and raised, and specifically West Auckland. So anyone who's from here knows once a Westie, always a Westie. So I'm here representing. I am of mixed heritage myself. My mother is Malaysian Chinese, so Chinese ethnicity from Malaysia. And my father is Pākehā descent or European descent if you're in Australia. And in this picture here is a very excited young me. I really can't remember what I was so excited about, but good for little me. And that's my gorgeous mother holding me and my fearless ama or grandmother in the background who came all the way over from Malaysia just to help look after me when I was a baby. So these are the women who are very formative in my life. And growing up, I always knew I wanted to be a professional ballet dancer. So, you never know where life is going to lead you. But the arts have been a very big part of my life all the way through. But unfortunately, I just couldn't really pick a genre. So I've ended up in history. But in fact, the connections that I have to art have, in their own strange way, led me here today and to this topic, as hopefully you'll see. So for those of you in Melbourne, shout out to you. I studied my undergraduate combined honours in history and musicology at the University of Melbourne, and then went on to do my PhD in Chinese diaspora history there in 2016. And this is when I first started to become really interested in issues of memory politics and representation. So as part of that, I didn't completely put down dance history. I moonlighted as a dance reviewer and all of those kinds of things. And my thesis involved a lot of looking at social networks, many of which were in social dance at the time, rites of passage like the debutante presentations at the Sydney Dragon Festival balls, which went on for about 40 years, where I came to realize how much, I guess, events that are now kind of seen as frivolous or, are not that visible. A lot of the time, the debutantes, for instance, are just visible in their pictures, but their voices aren't really heard. I started to realize that actually, when I went back and talked to people, that these were actually very formative moments in many of the lives of the young Chinese Australian women growing up, because it was their way of embodying a history that they couldn't see in history books, that connected them to their mothers, to their sisters, a long line of, very present Chinese Australian women. And yet at the same time, getting on as they got older and reflected, they were a little bit conflicted because I guess with feeling like debutantes can be a bit anti-feminist or something these days, they were a little bit unsure how to remember this or to incorporate that into their own life narrative. So memory was very much something that shifted and evolved as they grew up. And so I became really interested in the nexus between how we construct our histories and how people remember their own lives, and how that all comes together to create the narratives, the collective memories that we have that become our histories. So fast forward a few years and a shift back across to Wellington, and I joined Te Papa as a curator in 2019. And up until this point, a lot of the work that I had done was me off my own bat, engaging with institutions, but I could be a scholar and I could kind of be free about that. But this was a really great, education for me in what it means to be, a paid full-time employee curator at a public institution like a museum, with all that means. So Te Papa is a place which is a repository for the nation's collective memory, but that sounds really passive. It's also a site where histories are negotiated, affirmed, or contested all the time by so many different parties. It's a place that has its own history, kind of progressive roots, some might say, established in 1998 as a bicultural museum, reflected in its leadership structure and its architecture, but also inheriting the legacy collections of the old Colonial Museum and Dominion Museum before it. It's also an autonomous Crown entity. And I wanted to mention this because this might be a bit different for people who work in museums in Australia. So as an autonomous Crown entity, Te Papa remains outside. So we are part of the broader public sector that offers state services, but we are outside of the public service. So we're not technically public servants. And so we kind of walk a bit of a fine line where we're not separate from the government, but we operate at arm's length from it. So we take on guidance rather than formal direction from ministers. So, I think that's a really interesting dynamic, because you have a museum which is part of a sector that's increasingly proactive about acknowledging, that museums are not neutral and, trying to shape its own identity. And then you have this kind of, autonomous crown entity status where you always have to kind of keep one eye, even if it's at a distance, to what different ministers are saying. So, I just thought I'd put that out there. But I think in my first year at Te Papa, I got a really good, and especially good kind of grounding in what memory activism looks like within the museum, as I describe it. Because in my first year, we had so many different things happen. We had the Hong Kong protests of 2019 to 20, which began very, very soon after I started at Te Papa. There was the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, which everyone has experienced the effects of. And along with that, in a sort of similar time frame, there was the Black Lives Matter movement, which also the Te Papa engaged with as well. And a lot of my colleagues were involved in various programs and events and collecting work that related to that as well. So as you can imagine, with all of these different, pieces of work and events, you are engaging with so many different people who have different beliefs, different ideas of how they should play out. And so, I think it's been a really great kind of baptism by fire into things, but at the same time, it wasn't very long until I myself got quite a direct opportunity to kind of engage with memory activists, as I've called them, in my work. So I'd like to take us now through to my first example, which was the first kind of major piece of work that I did that involved activists at the museum. Sorry, I should keep up with myself, shouldn't I? Here we go. So in 2019, I began discussions as a representative of Te Papa with the collective We Are Kiwi Hong Kongers. And those discussions eventually led to the collection of a work of about 60 objects, including digital photos, flags, banners, clothes, stickers, even a cookie stamp at one point. And that was ultimately collected in 2021. So that work was about 2 years in the making, and hopefully you'll see why in a moment. But they kind of stemmed from discussions that happened after I was connected via mutual contact to one of the activists who was on the ground in Auckland, actually was a student at the University of Auckland, working on some of the events here. And those discussions eventually led to further connections with some of the activists in the group that she was connected to. And this work kind of evolved from there. So just for those of you who don't have much context, a little bit of background to the protests. So in 2019, the Fugitive Offenders and Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters Legislation Amendment Bill 2019, also known as the Hong Kong Extradition Bill, was first proposed, and if successfully passed, this legislation would have enabled Hong Kong residents to be extradited to mainland China to face trial. And this bill was triggered by a specific murder case, but the implications of passing the bill were, of course, much more profound than that. Under the One China, Two Systems approach, Hong Kong's legal system, which was modelled on the British system, remained separate, and there was a fear from some that by allowing suspected criminals to be extradited to China, it could potentially undermine the kind of firewall that protected Hong Kong's separate legal system. So the response to the anti-extradition bill was major protests across all different sections of society, unprecedented in scale. Some estimates around 1 million, though of course those figures are disputed. And although the extradition bill was withdrawn in October 2019, the protests had morphed by then into a broader set of demands. and they continued through the first half of 2020 until on the 30th of June 2020, the Chinese legislature approved the national security law, which effectively outlawed activities that were seen as dissenting or secessionist, which included the possession of protest banners and flags that carried slogans associated with the movement, such as Free Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Times. And so, you know, in tandem with this have been different ways in which both sides have tried to kind of, you know, take control of the narrative of the protests, whether that be as characterizing them as riots, you know, with foreign influence, or, you know, as people defending, you know, their freedoms. So the reason why I felt it was important to kind of give you that context is because it's within that activists have really worked to protect the public memory of Hong Kong protests. So memory has become a real kind of battleground, I guess, for activists as a result of that national security law. And so a lot of the Hong Kong activists have worked in collaboration with international allies, particularly Taiwan, but some of their supporters outside have also done work, like the We Are Kiwi Hong Kongers in Aotearoa. So I think that based on the kinds of aims that I've seen, the Hong Kong protesters that have worked with me, the different aims that they've
Grace, I've lost your audio. Is that the same for everyone?
Yes, the same.
Yeah, it's gone.
Oh,
Can you
it's
hear
back.
me?
Yep. It's back.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'll just carry on from here. So as I was saying, I think that the work of the Hong Kong activists that I've encountered, the way they talk about their work and the importance of it, I would think that they very much fall under this category of memory activist. So of course the question is, what is memory activism? What is this work that I'm suggesting that they are doing? So, you know, I know that definitions are very much imperfect and evolving, and that's very true of memory activism, which is a very new field. But I think these two definitions by Gutmann and Furstenberg do help kind of tease out some important points. So I'm not sure if I can even, I guess I can read it off my my sheet here. So the first definition is probably the one I've seen in use the most at the moment, which is the strategic commemoration of a contested past to achieve mnemonic or political change by working outside state channels. So, you know, the important part of this is a contested past, commemorating a contested past. The working outside state channels, this is where I think there's a little bit of debate, because although memory activism is often leveled at or against a state, it can also involve some level of collaboration with a state as well. So there's still a little bit of debate on that. And I've plucked out this earlier definition as well, how activists produce cultural memory that aims to challenge hegemonic narratives, because I think that last part, to challenge hegemonic narratives, is still really important now, because a lot of people who do this kind of work, that is their main aim. The exact nature of the change that they are wanting to create, that might be a little bit nebulous, or it might come later, but the key part is to challenge the dominant narratives first and kind of break down the dominant systems and see what arises from that. So based on the activists I've worked with who are very much keen to protect the material heritage of the Hong Kong protests, and to be able to record their own stories, potentially challenging, characterizations, official characterizations from Beijing of their actions as riots, for instance, and just to have it recorded in the history books that there were supporters in Aotearoa who stood up and people internationally who were there. I think that these are all kinds of aims that make the Hong Kong group very much memory activists of some description. So to give you an idea of the work that did end up in the museum, in the collection, I've just plucked out a couple of highlights. So this is a linen wall patchwork banner. It was created in Hong Kong and brought to New Zealand in 2019 by 2 Hong Kong social workers. And it's hand-stitched and contains messages of support from Hong Kong protesters. So the social workers who came, they were tourists who spent about 6 months previously taking part in Hong Kong and then came to New Zealand and displayed this banner on their camper van while travelling around New Zealand. And when it was their time to leave, they decided to gift the banner to the We Are Kiwi Hong Kongers group to help them keep generating support for the cause. And that group then used this banner in their solidarity rallies in Aotearoa Square in Auckland. So it's kind of got a transnational story to it and very much connects the movement activists that were in Hong Kong with activists on the ground here in Aotearoa. And I also just wanted to kind of mention that the linen wall inspiration is also very important because, linen walls have their own creative inspiration and history, with the first linen wall in Prague being inspired by John Lennon's lyrics to the first linen wall in Hong Kong, and that sprung up during the umbrella movement all the way through to the many that popped up during the 2019 and 20 protests. There have been all manner of artistic works that have spawned from this. I think Ai Weiwei created a flag that was inspired by the post-it note kind of aesthetic that you can see here as well. And the designer for my own book actually was really taken with this patchwork banner and has been using it as inspiration as a designer in their own work for Between Dreams. And so this is a slightly different example, also a banner, but this is a banner by a child, Alexa, that's a pseudonym, who was 10 years old at the time. Alexa's mother is an activist, and this banner was used by Alexa with her mother at a Hong Kong protest rally in Aotearoa Square in Auckland in 2019. And I think the reason why I think her and her mother wanted to bring this message out is, of course, because Alexa is a child and many of the protesters weren't that much older than Alexa who were involved. And so that was the kind of message that they wanted to send. And to make this banner, Alexa created all of the paper cranes herself and then glued them on with a hot glue gun, supervised by her mother, I'm pretty sure. But I think this is an interesting piece because part of the story that they chose to share with it was the fact that Alexa's involvement in the protests also resulted in, some real world fallout with her classmates as well. And, I think that's important to acknowledge that this is quite a sensitive subject with a lot of people, even people within families who have really, been torn apart by things that have happened in Hong Kong. So Alexa's story was that she told one of her friends that she was on the protesters' side, and that friend told her mother, and her mother told her friend not to play with her anymore. Her mum said that we are rejecting her home country since she was on the China side. This is Alexa's words, so I felt kind of hurt. So, there's the element of taking part in protests, but there is a cost as well. And I think especially when you're talking about children, definitely there's a lot of fraught issues there around, permissions and ethics and things like that. So I guess from the point of view of the museum, this kind of object allows us to be able to talk about some of those issues, even within a collection that is very much, from an activist group about, promoting their cause. So the two objects that I just mentioned, they are very much ones that have a New Zealand and Hong Kong element to them. And this was because a defining aspect of the protests, apart from their scale, was the deliberate appeal to the international front. So those links are important for museums to represent, but it was also necessary to fit with the museum's collection priorities, because as a national museum, Te Papa, of course, it prioritizes materials relating to New Zealand. So at the end of the day, you kind of can't get away from having to find a way to fit, your proposals for things in the collection with official policies and strategies and things like that. So I've just put up here what is now the Asian Aotearoa sort of key themes and things that we use in our proposals at Te Papa. This didn't exist for the Hong Kong collection, but it is what we were able to use for the Iranian Women, Life, Freedom collection, which I'm about to talk about. So this is something that's evolving, but yeah, a key part of the process. And this is the first organizational strategy to actually specifically include Asian Aotearoa as a distinct area of focus. So it's very much a new area, but hopefully a growing one. So just quickly, this kind of work doesn't happen, as I said, without costs, and there definitely were a few challenges along the way, including for the activists. Safety was a major thing that we had to keep in mind, because the museum's systems are very much designed to encourage transparency, easy linking up of things. And when you're dealing with people who largely want to remain anonymous or don't want pieces of information to be linked always, or to have their creative work, linked to their name, that's something we had to really work quite carefully with the rights teams and legal teams at Te Papa just to work out. And another aspect of this is that, this work took 2 years. In 2019, it wasn't illegal as such to have banners and things like that. But by the time the national security law was passed, it became a lot more risky for people to hold on to these kinds of items. So the security and the safety kind of balance started to shift, even as we were doing this work, often with some quite young people who are international students usually. So it's just something that we had to keep kind of navigating as we went. And so far, so good. But, it's just something that we really need to, I want to put on the radar there for the future. All right, so I'm going to leave Hong Kong there and move on for a bit to talk about the Women, Life, Freedom collecting that we did, just because I think it's, of course, a very different, context, but it's also a really good point of comparison with the Hong Kong collection. So a little bit of background again. I won't go into it too much because I know there's been papers here already about Iran, but in September 2022, Kurdish-Iranian woman Gina Mahsa Amini was arrested and beaten by morality police in Tehran, Iran, for improperly wearing her hijab, and died from her injuries a few days later. And this sparked major protests across Iran, which led to the Women, Life, Freedom movement. And, this has been met with violent suppression by the Iranian government, and the arrest of, between 2022 and 2023, around 22,000 protesters and people connected to them. So much like with the Hong Kong movement, a lot of people in Iran, but around the world, including in New Zealand, staged their own protests. against the Iranian government, the execution of protesters, and the oppression of women's rights in Iran. And all around the world, there were streets and parks and squares that were also named in Amini's memories, for instance, in London, Ottawa, Paris, and Vienna. So at Te Papa, in 2023, so a few months after those protests, we began working with some local Iranian activists to document their solidarity activism around the movement. And the main group that we collaborated with was the Iranian Solidarity Group New Zealand, which formed just a few days really after Amini's death. But there were also sister groups. So they're based in Wellington, but they had connections to sister groups in Auckland and Christchurch too. So this is a kind of combined collection. And unlike the Hong Kong collection, which is mostly, amateur creatives, people who would probably identify as activists first, the Iranian collection was a mix of amateur and professional artists who lent their skills to the activist cause. So this picture here is of a rally in Auckland, and this is one of the ones that was taken by a member of the group, so who would consider themselves an amateur photographer, but it is a beautiful photo. So this is just a snapshot of the kinds of things that you'll find in that collection. We collected posters and memorabilia from the group. So what was really interesting about the way that the activists work is a lot of them, they were working with activists in Australia and elsewhere, and they had this big kind of database of different creative works, and they all kind of used the same collective pool of works for their different protests, so that the same kinds of symbols and things kind of ended up being utilized across the world. So that's very much true of this symbol of the fist that you can see in both the poster for protest there and the shirt. But we also collected things like hair, which was that one of the protesters cut during a rally, which is something I don't think everyone would expect to find in our collection. But as you've already heard today, hair has been a really intimate and powerful symbol of women's resistance. And so being able to show that in tandem with, photographs and things from that actual event is really powerful from a historical perspective. So, I'm very mindful of time, so I'm just going to keep focused on points of comparison a bit with Hong Kong. So much like that collection, there were many challenges in this collection. It also took about 2 years to come to this point. So it's only been very recently, kind of delivered to Te Papa. But one of the major ones was simply selecting or curating the materials. So when we were working with the Hong Kong activists, as I said, they're mainly very busy students. A lot of them weren't necessarily super organized around their archival things, which is very typical and normal of people who are in the midst of, protests. They're not really thinking about archiving their own legacy at that point. But with the Iranian community, a lot of them were people who had PhDs, who were professional, artists and photographers, who worked in the public sector or public service in some way. So, probably doing research and things. So they were very, very organized, and they had super organized archives of their photos, particularly the professional photographers that we had each had, they had everything organized right down to folders that had, the year, the protest, and the specific photographer that it was for. So that was amazing, but it did also mean that we received far more from them than we could ever collect at an institution like Te Papa, because museums are not archives. We tend to be very selective because we're an exhibiting institution first and foremost, and so we're not able to, collect the full range of things that researchers might want. And usually we would get around this by asking our donors to maybe pre-curate a bit of a long list for us. But activists, they're busy people, especially when the events are live and happening now. So, they just didn't have the time, and that's completely understandable. But what this does mean is that to support them, myself and some of my team members, we did end up spending a lot of time combing through the images that we would end up acquiring and putting the long lists together ourselves, doing a lot of the selecting, and then going back to the group for them to review and comment on and kind of do this iterative process. So, of course, in a process like that, it means that curators do end up having a lot of influence in shaping that final selection. And of course, we've got to bear in mind the collection acquisition process and the policies and how we're going to argue it through. So there are all of these other kinds of priorities that are kind of competing, I guess, with grassroots, kinds of priorities that, so you might have ended up with a different collection than what you might have ended up with if you just let the group, select without any curatorial intervention. And security considerations. These were different again to the Hong Kong group. So the amateur photographers, much like the Hong Kongers, they were happy to have things donated as part of the group, but they didn't want to put their name to things. But the professional photographers were very much, they have their own archive, they have their own work, so they were very much of the opinion that if it was their work, they wanted to have their name attached to it. However, they were quite careful about not wanting to have their work administratively tied to a political group like Iranian Solidarity Group New Zealand. So although, they were at the events and things like that, we ended up having to create administratively a lot of different accession lots, as we call it, so that each of the photographers could sign their own deed of gift, could sign things away, so that it was they were donating directly to the museum and not via a political group, so that that connection is a little bit less, it's a little bit less front and center. And, that makes sense to me that they would want to maintain their independence. In some cases, the photographers still going back to Iran, which is, risky given the work that they're doing. So, yeah, quite a different kind of conversation there, but, still centering around safety. And I'm not sure if the people out there in Australia, you might recognize this face. This is Behruz Bachani, who was a former Manus Island detainee, who now lives in Wellington. So this is Behruz at one of the Iranian Solidarity Group events speaking in Wellington. And the reason I've brought him up here is because I've sort of mentioned to you a little bit about the curatorial group kind of dynamic. But as a curator, I'm also trying to learn a little bit about the internal group dynamics as well. And something that I think is a challenge, I think, for curators, especially those of us who are, outside of the community, is working out how to best work with groups to represent a movement. So, for example, the Iranian Solidarity Group is, a lot of the people I worked with were Persian women, but they were very conscious, I think, of Gina or Mahsa Amini's Kurdish identity as well, because she's not just a woman, she's a Kurdish Iranian woman. And so they're Persian women, they don't necessarily they have privilege, I guess, relative to Amini. And one of the supporters of the movement in Wellington was Behruz. And of course, if anyone knows much about Behruz's politics, he's very much, he's Kurdish, and he's very much about promoting, Kurdish rights, language and culture. So, his influence probably, I think, played into that with the group. But it was really interesting because, of course, Behruz might be Kurdish, but he is also a man. So there were things that the Persian woman would also be reminding him, well, you know, there are things that you can do that we in Iran can't do. So there was a lot of really interesting discussion that I got to be a part of, just, you know, sitting down and having dinner with people and all of that, which I think is really important. But yeah, it's a lot of learning, I think, for a curator. And I think you do really have to get you want to learn, really. And the reason I've brought up Gina Amini or Masa Amini here is because Masa Amini is the name that Masa is probably most well known by in newspaper reports, but it's kind of a legal name. And at least this is what my Iranian Solidarity Group members told me, that her own family would refer to her as Gina because that's the name they gave her. And so in their guidance to the curators about how to talk about the collection, they very much wanted us to use the name Gina and put the name Masa in brackets, which is what I've been doing in this talk. So there are a lot of different elements at play here. And I just wanted to acknowledge that some of you might be thinking that is a lot of work to just get some objects into a building, especially if there's no exhibitions or anything planned. So I just have a couple more slides just to kind of give you a sense of why having objects in the museum can continue to kind of be important even after the work's been done, so to speak. So with the Iranian Solidarity Group, they actually came to us about something completely different originally. They wanted to have a Hafsin table put out for Nowruz, the Persian New Year, partly as a result of their kind of memory activist aims to just have a non-political way to create more visibility for the Iranian community that was more accessible and didn't go into politics. But at the time we couldn't do that, one, because it was too close to March at the time, and we didn't really have an existing connection with them, and lots of things in the museum are prioritized based on the work that curators are doing. So we ended up working with them on this collection, and the next year I was able to make an argument for them to be able to have the Hafsin table at Nowruz, and that was supported because we were actively working with them through curatorial. So sometimes you can have these public events and things because there's a priority existing within the museum that you can kind of say in the business plan, hey, you know, you other groups are supposed to be supporting the curatorial effort. So it's a little bit of behind the scenes kind of activism, I guess, going on there. And with the Hong Kong collection, just to return to that, Te Papa didn't really, promote the acquisition really loudly when it happened, but the collection was covered by Stan News and Radio Free Asia. Te Papa wasn't quoted in those articles. As I said, Te Papa's a Crown entity. You have to be a bit careful about what you're saying, but the activists are not bound by the same issues that curators would be, for instance. So Stan News and Radio Free Asia were able to talk to the activists freely, and they were able to discuss freely their reasons for making the donation and speak on things in a way that, you know, the museum officially wouldn't be able to do. So in a way, they were able to kind of leverage the fact that they had brought a collection into a national collection. And even though we weren't really there talking about it, that gave them a platform to kind of further their aims a bit more. So yeah, I hope that gives you a little bit of an insight into some of the ways in which art meets history at Te Papa, and how this is all kind of a way of trying to using the past to kind of influence events on the ground, and things that involve engaging the past that also have real contemporary potential consequences and risks as well. So to end my talk, I've just got a few questions that I'll leave you with and that I'm still pondering too, including, how should museums and galleries engage with memory activism and memory activists, which is very much a reality now? And does it make a difference if the parties involved identify their work as stemming from an artistic practice, or an activist practice. At Te Papa, as you've seen, we've got so many different policies and things, and there's very much a national significance element that we have to meet. So my question is, can institutions like Te Papa even fully work in the interests of marginalised Asian communities on these kinds of topics, especially where they're a bit politically sensitive? And then this is something that I'm interested in following up. But, you know, what are the wider ripple effects of these kinds of behind-the-scenes choices and debates on our communities, on our histories, and on our artistic practices? Because, you know, these activities involve a lot of risk, but the reason that the activists who've engaged with the museum take them is because they feel it's worth it, because it is doing something to help further their aims now. So I would really love to know more about how they feel about that several years down the track. All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for listening to me, and I look forward to the questions in the Q&A.